come to you directly from Hofstra University. Anyone watch the debate on Tuesday night? A lot of you did. You know what they gave us at the university as little souvenirs? How about this? Binders. Binders. But my binder is not full of women. It's filled with notes. I have covered politics for quite a long time, including here in Chicago. You stole one of my best stories in Chicago. I did, in fact, attend that rally with Mayor Byrne, who was running for re-election, and she was speaking at great length about immigration rights to an audience that she probably did not know was Puerto Rican. And I did have to remind her staff that these people are not immigrants. Puerto Ricans are Americans. They're American citizens by birth, so that she might want to think about what she has to say to them. I've been around a long time. First of all, let me say I'm honored by this invitation, and I'm delighted to be here to be able to share with you some of my observations about what's happening in American politics. I have been doing this a long time. I was reminded of that on a couple of occasions. Back in 2008 at the Republican convention in St. Paul, I saw Sarah Palin, who had just been named to the ticket as vice president. She was marching down the hall, surrounded by security, and she saw me in the hallway, and she stopped, and she looked at me, and then she reached out her hand, and she said, "I want to shake your hand. I'm a big fan. I've been watching you since I was a little girl." To which I said, "Thank you, I think." Some years ago, I was in Britain. I've covered politics in a lot of foreign countries, Chicago, the United Kingdom, and I was introduced to a gentleman who had just become the leader of the Conservative Party, a fellow by the name of David Cameron. And we had a drink together in London, and we chatted for about 5 minutes, and he said, you seem to know a good deal about British politics. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I've covered every general election in Britain since 1974. And he said, really, 1974? I said, yes. You may remember that there were 2 elections that year. The first one did not produce a majority, so they had to have another one a few months later. And he looked at me fairly blankly, and he said, I don't really remember that. You see, I was 6 years old. That's a long time that I've been here. My good fortune, I always say, is to have experienced several what I call consciousness-changing events in public life. And those are the moments that we journalists live for. When a vivid experience causes public opinion to change virtually overnight. And we have all these theories and processes of social change, but sometimes things change with amazing speed. My baptism in fire and television news came during the Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Clarence Thomas in 1991. That was the first live event I covered on television. And I can assure you, I did not know what was going on, and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee did not know what was going on. But until Anita Hill gave her testimony, men regarded sexual harassment as something of a joke. They thought of it as flirting, innocent. They failed to comprehend women's anger and humiliation. Anita Hill's testimony on that occasion turned out to be one of those rare moments when public consciousness changed really almost overnight. After she testified about her degrading experience, sexual harassment was transformed overnight from a joke to a crime. I grew up in the segregated South in Virginia. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, her action released the pent-up frustration and anger of millions of people. Southern whites who had allowed themselves to believe that segregation worked suddenly saw how outraged black people were to live under a Jim Crow system. Consciousness changed virtually overnight, and eventually a social order was completely transformed. When Matthew Shepard was brutally murdered on a Wyoming fence post in 1998, the public began to understand the violence and brutality that gay people face. Previously, when we had done interviews and polls on gay rights, many Americans saw gay rights as a solution for which there was no known problem. Why do gays need rights? They have the same rights as everyone else. But consciousness changed as a result of that terrible, terrible event. And now, same-sex marriage is becoming a reality across the country. And in fact, it could well be that in this year, in this election, in the state of Maryland, Maryland could be the first state in the country where same-sex marriage is legalized by a popular vote. It was legalized briefly in California, and then it was reversed, but that wasn't by, it was reversed by popular vote in California under Proposition 8. There's been no referendum held anywhere in the country where same-sex marriage was approved popularly. It's been done by courts, it's been done in New York by the legislature, in the District of Columbia by the City Council, but this would be the first popular referendum in which people may yet vote to allow same-sex marriage in their state. Things are changing very rapidly. This campaign is the great showdown between the old America and the new America. The old America met in August in Tampa, Florida. The new America met last month in Charlotte, North Carolina. What the country really wants to know is which America can manage the economy better? And the answer is not clear, which is why this election is so very close. The old America got us into this mess. The new America can't seem to get us out of it. The old America's rallying cry at the Republican convention was "Restore our future," which is the slogan of the Romney campaign. Take us back to the days when America was rich and great and powerful, the undisputed leader of the world. Governor Romney declared, "You might ask yourself if these last years are really the America we want, the America that was won for us by the greatest generation." The old America looked overwhelmingly white and middle-aged, or older. The celebrity who captured the spirit of the old America was Clint Eastwood, talking to his chair. He is 82 years old. The new America's rallying cry at the Democratic convention was "Forward, not back." President Obama declared when Governor Romney finally had a chance to reveal the secret sauce, he did not offer a single new idea. It was just the same old politics that we've been hearing from his party for decades. Nothing new. The new America celebrated diversity in age and race and sexual orientation and lifestyles. The old America didn't have lifestyles. They had lives. Lifestyle is a 60s term. The Hollywood celebrity who captured the spirit of the new America, who addressed the Democratic convention, was, anyone remember? Scarlett Johansson, age 27. At the two conventions, we saw the ultimate triumph of the great values divide that first became visible in California back in the 1960s. Back in 1967, the late political scientist James Q. Wilson, who grew up in what he called Reagan country, wrote an article in which he tried to explain the political culture of Southern California to puzzled Eastern intellectuals. The Goldwater and Reagan movements were protest movements, Wilson argued, but they were not expressions of personal unhappiness or frustration or despair. Just the opposite. In describing the right wing, which had just emerged as a force in American politics, Professor Wilson pointed out that, quote, "It is not with their lot that they are discontent, it is with the lot of the nation. The very virtues that they have and practice are, in their eyes, conspicuously absent from society as a whole." The same year, Richard Todd, who went to school in California, wrote an article in Harper's Magazine, 1967, in which he tried to explain the Berkeley phenomenon to puzzled outsiders. Why had that campus become the focal point of student unrest? Was it true, as many commentators suggested, that Berkeley students were frustrated and dehumanized by the mega university, and their political protest was an expression of personal anger and discontent? Mr. Todd found very little evidence of despair or alienation at Berkeley, where he had attended school. What he found instead was what he called a sense of rightness, the peculiar kind of joy that is the result of self-absorption. Berkeley students lived by a code of tolerance, openness, free expression, nonviolence, and permissiveness. What they were angry about was the country didn't live by those same rules. And they were very angry that this was a country that was racist and was pursuing a pointless foreign war. Both the new America and the old America draw support from people who feel certain about their own values and resentful that the rest of the country doesn't accept them. and each one has captured a political party. The columnist David Brooks at the New York Times wrote, "What we have is two parties that are really into themselves." After nearly 50 years of conflict, the two Americas have finally fought each other to a standoff, which is where we are this year. I like to say that the United States of America is the most populous country in the world. Populist, L-I-S-T. Most populous country in the world. That's the first sentence in my book. America is the most populous country in the world. Next to the United States, the rest of the world is Saudi Arabia. This is a country where the people really do rule. Do you know that we're the only country in the world that elects judges? State judges, not federal judges. No other country does that because other countries don't trust the idea of popular justice. Popular justice reminds people too much of Soviet show trials or lynch mobs, which is a form of popular justice we once had in this country. But here we do elect judges, and in fact, a lot of conservatives are crusading to have federal judges answerable to the people. That if they make unpopular decisions, even on the Supreme Court, they should be at least answerable to Congress, if not to the American people. Here, the people actually do rule. We're the only country in the world that mints coins that people refuse to use. In Canada, they have loonies. In Europe, they have 1 and 2 euro coins. But whenever we've tried to mint dollar coins, you ever see the Sacagawea coin and the Susan B. Anthony coin, Americans just say, to hell with it. They're not going to use them. And so we have 1 billion of those coins locked up in mints because people won't be told they have to use it. And they won't be told they have to use the metric system, even though it's scientific and rational. You propose that, and that'll be the end of you politically. Europe doesn't have a death penalty because elites in Europe have declared it's cruel and barbaric. But in the United States, if you propose abolishing the death penalty, you could be in very serious trouble politically because the people want it. Well, we are a populist society. The problem is we have 2 candidates now running for president who both in their way represent upper middle class elites, but they are bitterly competitive elites. Romney represents the elite of wealth, or as Republicans like to put it, the elite of success. Romney said in Tampa, the centerpiece of the president's entire re-election campaign is attacking success. In America, we should celebrate success. We never apologize for it. President Obama represents the elite of education. The president told the Democratic delegates, education was the gateway of opportunity for me. It was the gateway for Michelle. It was the gateway for most of you. Neither candidate really has a populist bone in his body. Romney keeps calling attention to his wealth or hiding it in his tax returns. He talks about having 3 homes, bets people $10,000. He knows sports team owners. His wife drives a couple of Cadillacs. One of these days he's going to say, let them eat cake, and that will be the end of it. Obama sometimes seems disdainful of people who are less enlightened than he is, or as he once described them, people who cling to guns or religion. What the Democrats had to do was trot out their old warhorse, former President Bill Clinton, to get the populist juices flowing. He connects with ordinary people and ordinary voters in a way that neither Romney nor Obama really does. Clinton is uniquely qualified to make the case that Democrats really do know how to manage the economy. Voters associate Bill Clinton with good times in every sense of the word. Now, I recall back at the beginning of 2011, the president of China visited Washington. Then it was Jintao. And it occurred to me when he visited Washington, a thought came into my head, I wrote a column about it, that in the 1960s, China experienced the great proletarian cultural revolution, one of the great tragedies of human history. But they got over it. In the 1960s, the United States experienced the great American cultural revolution, and our problem is we've never gotten over it. It's a revolution that's still being fought. 8 years ago, Bill Clinton offered his defining explanation of American politics. He said, quote, if you look back on the 60s, and on balance you think there was more good than harm, you're probably a Democrat. And if you think there was more harm than good, you're probably a Republican. Bill Clinton Meet George W. Bush. Same generation, totally different values, and a totally different experience of the changes wrought by the 1960s. The 60s opened up the great divide between left and right, liberal and conservative, in American politics. It was a divide over values. Politics is about two different things, values and interests. Sometimes people vote their interests, but sometimes they ignore their interests and vote their values. Tom Frank wrote a book about what's the matter with Kansas after the 2004 election. He was greatly perturbed by the fact that Kansas used to be a hotbed of economic radicalism. It's a state that had a lot of poor farmers and workers, and has now become, it was way on the left economically for a long time during the populist era. It was the state that produced Mary Lease, a populist leader who said farmers should raise more hay and less corn. But somehow Kansas has become one of the most solidly conservative and Republican states in the country. How could this happen? Why didn't they vote their interests? Because they were voting their values, and that really started in the 60s. And their values were deeply religious and deeply conservative, and they gave their values priorities over their interests. So do a lot of wealthy and high income and high status people. Jewish voters, for instance. If Jewish voters voted their values, they would probably vote, their interests. If they voted their interests, they would probably vote Republican, because they tend to be, on the average, higher status, well-educated. They don't particularly want to pay higher taxes if Obama is reelected. And their interests are also identified with the state of Israel. And the Prime Minister of Israel has, I think, in a grievous error of judgment, made Israel a partisan issue, which it never was in the past. He has more or less endorsed Mitt Romney for president. So those Jewish voters who, for whom Israel is the top priority issue, a lot of them are voting for Mitt Romney. But most Jewish voters are not going to vote for Mitt Romney, despite their interests. They're going to vote their values, because their values have historically been liberal values. I remember some years ago, I was in West Virginia interviewing a panel of voters. This was in 2004. And I asked them how many of them had health insurance. In a group of 10 voters, only 3 did. And then I said, do you think either of the candidates is talking about bringing health insurance to people like yourselves? And they said, well, they thought John Kerry was talking about that in the election. And I said, would you consider voting for Kerry? And they said, oh, no, we couldn't do that. And I said, why not? And they said, because he would take away our guns. And I said, so what you're saying is your guns are more important than your health insurance. And one woman turned to me and she said, mister, our guns are our health insurance. That's the kind of forces that drive the vote in this country. Educated upper middle class liberals embraced the great social causes of the 60s, civil rights, anti-war, women's rights, gay rights. Republicans profited from the backlash against those causes. Richard Nixon used his Southern strategy to fold racial backlash voters north and south into the Republican Party. Then 10 years later, Ronald Reagan added the religious right, Americans who see abortion rights and gay rights as an assault on their religious freedoms. The Republican Party under Nixon and then Reagan acquired a new populist base. These are people who call themselves values voters. I always get in trouble when I use the phrase values voters. You know, they have a values voter coalition that meets in Washington every year. Sarah Palin always addresses them. Liberals get fairly insulted by the term values voters because they say, we have values too. But these people have somehow appropriated the term values voters. What happened really is, in this country, happened nowhere else. The changes, the turmoil of the 60s was something felt across the entire Western world and in China. It was an era of great upheaval. But in the United States, more than anywhere else, there was a ferocious backlash against those changes. Why? Because of one unique feature of American culture and society. We are the most religious, advanced industrial country in the world. More than Ireland, more than Italy. People in Europe don't go to church anymore. Churches are empty. People in Canada don't go to church anymore. But here in the United States, 40% of Americans tell poll takers that they go to church every week. The ministers say we don't see them, but religion is very important. That's because of the way we were founded and the way we were settled. The United States uniquely was settled by people who support dissenting churches. They came here seeking religious freedom. And so religion was a core part of their identity, and they have preserved and cultivated their religious values. We're not the only Protestant country in the world, majority Protestant, but we're the only country where the dominant religion is dissenting churches, people who are escaping the power of established churches. And that's produced this division that we talk about in American politics and in American life. I recall, I was a visiting professor at a great Jesuit university, Boston College, back in the early 1990s. And I was the Speaker Thomas P. O'Neill Jr. Distinguished Visiting Professor of American Politics, a title I always cherished. And one of the privileges of that position, I was there for 5 years, was that I was invited to tea with the Cardinal. Ooh, I'd never met a Cardinal before. I was invited to tea with the Cardinal on a Friday afternoon. The first thing I discovered was that if you have tea with the Cardinal in Boston, it could be a good deal stronger than tea. Tea is available, and I had tea. But there were other things available as well. And I was ushered into the Cardinal's holy presence, and he welcomed me. And he asked a question which I anticipated. He said, "You are the Speaker Thomas P. O'Neill Jr., Distinguished Visiting Professor of American Politics. What should I know is happening in American politics?" This was in 1992. And I said, "Well, Your Eminence, what you should know is that since Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, we've seen a new division in the United States. It's a religious division, but it's not between religions. It's not between Protestants and Catholics, the way it used to be. It's a division between the churched and the unchurched. What we're finding is that people who are deeply religious, who go to church regularly and say that religion is the most important element in their life, they've become more and more Republican. Since that was 1992, in the last 12 years, they've become more and more Republican. And that includes observant Catholics, and it includes fundamentalist Protestants, and it even includes Orthodox Jews who have become more and more Republican. People who are irreligious, who don't go to church or synagogue regularly, and for whom religion isn't the core part of their identity, they've become more and more Democratic, and the Democrats have become a secular party. He regarded this, of course, with great interest. But then I went a step too far. I said, "You know, Your Eminence, it bothers me that we now have a religious party in this country." And the Cardinal thought about that for a moment, and he said, "You know, it bothers me that we have an irreligious party in this country." To which I said, "I think I'll have more tea." But that is the case. Democrats have learned through bitter experience that Americans do not want to glorify single mothers or homosexuals or illegal immigrants or other unconventional groups, but they don't want to stigmatize them either. Conservative rhetoric on social issues has become harshly stigmatizing, and it's acquired a tone of meanness, too much harsh denunciation, too much smug self-righteousness, too many issues that are posed as us versus them. Ronald Reagan, whom I greatly admire, Ronald Reagan was not a hater. He shared none of the malice that we see in our recent campaigns. Reagan never veered from his conservative faith, but he never stigmatized those who disagreed with him. He made it clear that they were welcome in the party, even appointed pro-choice Republicans to positions of power. The last 4 presidents of the United States have gotten elected on a pledge to end the bitter divisions in American politics. 4 presidents in a row, and they all failed. The first President Bush offered a kinder, gentler politics. He lasted 1 term. Bill Clinton called himself a new Democrat and an advocate of the third way. He got impeached. Now it's interesting, Clinton's experience is interesting because he really was a moderate on policies. His signature policies that he supported and passed as president, his legacy, were all supported by Republicans. Democrats didn't agree with him. Free trade and NAFTA, Democrats wouldn't vote for that. Welfare reform, that was passed by Republicans. A balanced budget. I remember in 1996, Clinton announced a deal with Speaker Newt Gingrich to have a balanced budget in the country, which they achieved. The budget was balanced for 4 years. They achieved a balanced budget. I thought the Democrats in Congress would have a thrombosis because they thought President Clinton was undercutting them. Just about everything he achieved by working with Republicans. Then they turned around and impeached him. There's the thanks of a grateful party. I once interviewed, during the impeachment proceedings, I came up here to Chicago, to Naperville, I think it was. I interviewed a leading conservative who is no longer with us, and I asked him, he was the head of the Chicago City Club, and I asked him, why do you hate Bill Clinton so much? And he grew very agitated and red in the face, and he started pounding the table. He said, why do I hate Bill Clinton so much? He said, I hate that man because he's a womanizing, Elvis-loving, non-inhaling, truth-shading, war-protesting, draft-dodging, abortion-promoting, gay-protecting, gun-hating baby boomer. I see, I said. It's not the policies, it's the values. And he said, you're right. It's the values. That's what I hate about him. And that's why Clinton ended up producing or ended up leaving office with a very divided country. The second President Bush said he would be, you may remember this, a uniter, not a divider. He took a divided country and he divided it even more. Barack Obama created a sensation when he said in 2004, there's not a liberal America and a conservative America, there's the United States of America. And what he got in return was a Tea Party revolt. They all failed. What will it take to end this bitter division? A great national trauma, I used to say. We had one, September 11th, 2001. I remember writing after that terrible event, after a respectful interval, I said, there's only one thing good that could possibly come out of this. It could finally bring the country together after years of division. And I can tell you it did for 1 year. For 1 year, September 01 to September 02, even Democrats supported President Bush. They don't believe they did, but I can prove it. They supported President Bush. The country was brought together. Until September 02, when the Bush administration announced the rollout of the Iraq War. And when that entered the agenda, all the old divisions resurfaced and the country became bitterly divided once again. President Obama was not a child of the 60s like Bill Clinton. He was too young. In his book, The Audacity of Hope, Obama wrote that as he reflected on 2000 and 2004, those presidential elections, he wrote, I sometimes felt as if I were watching the psychodrama of the baby boomers, a tale rooted in old grudges and revenge plots hatched on a handful of college campuses a long time ago. He's not of the generation of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. And there was a great deal of hope that he could end those culture wars that have been inflicted on us by the 1960s. He hasn't been able to succeed in doing that either. And he is supposed to be the great charismatic leader who would bring the country together. When I'm asked today, how will we ever end this division, the only answer I can give is that it'll probably take the passing of a generation, my generation, the baby boom generation, Bill Clinton's generation, George W. Bush's generation. That's what it took to finally end the last great civil war in American politics. The Civil War of the 1860s poisoned a generation of our politics going right into the 20th century. Republicans would regularly wave the bloody shirt in order to win elections by reviving the cause of the Civil War. That didn't end until the Civil War generation passed from the scene. And the 60s generation may end up having to pass from the scene. I can tell you this, politics is and continues to be a blood sport. President Obama's problem is he's not a warrior. That's why he lost the first debate. President Obama is rational, and he's deliberate, and he's thoughtful. Those are very good things if you're a college professor. They're not so terrific if you're fighting a battle. Democrats were enraged by Obama's performance. It was bloodless. He did not show enough fight in that first debate, so he came roaring back on Tuesday evening at Hofstra. And the two, I don't know what your impression was, but I was sitting there watching them and I said, these two guys do not like each other very much. They were very much in each other's face. But Obama is not, that was a bit of a surprise because Obama is not by temperament a warrior. He represents the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the wing that's dominated by educated upper middle class liberals. They don't like a lot of fighting. I often call them NPR Democrats. NPR is talk radio for liberals, okay? All things considered. Conservatives do not consider all things. Rush Limbaugh considers what he damn well wants to consider. The Clintons represent the populist wing of the party. They get the support of working class white voters who like their politics pretty bloody. Hillary Clinton was their champion in 2008. She ran as a fighter. There's one thing you know about me, I am no shrinking violet, she said. If I tell you I will fight for you, that's exactly what I intend to do. Obama promised to end all the fighting. He argued that voters were not, quote, looking for politicians to be calling each other names and acting with a lot of bluster. Well, Tuesday night he decided he better start fighting. He better show some fight, and he better build up a little bluster. And he did so, I think, quite successfully in the confrontation with Governor Romney, who was, in my estimation, I said this on air, he was a bit of a bully in that debate. And I thought Obama scored points, and Democrats were grateful because they were looking for a leader who can stand up to a bully. Obama's performance in that first debate unfortunately confirmed the stereotype of the weak liberal. That was an image created by George McGovern in 1972, who said he was 1,000% behind his running mate before he dropped him from the ticket. And Walter Mondale in 1984, who got pushed around by all the special interests. And Michael Dukakis in 1988, who looked fairly foolish riding in a tank. Democrats used to be tough guys. That was in the days of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson and the Kennedys. If you defied John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy would come after you. My God, if you defied Lyndon Johnson, you'd wake up the next morning missing an important body part. You paid a price. Back in the 1932 campaign, Franklin Roosevelt promised an audience in Pittsburgh that he would balance the budget while he would cut government operations by 25%. He did not do either one in his first term. He never did them. Roosevelt's press secretary asked the president in 1936 how he should respond when reporters asked him about that promise. And Franklin Roosevelt said famously, "Steve, tell them I've never been to Pittsburgh." President Obama needs to pick up some of that spirit, that fighting spirit, if he wants to win this election. Finally, and very seriously about this election, a question has to be asked. It's a question, to borrow a movie title, will there be blood? The question sounds far-fetched, but consider the extreme hatred that seems to be driving American politics right now. Case in point, a judge in Texas warned that a civil war was possible if President Obama is reelected. Is that the ravings of a right-wing lunatic? Look at the intemperate language being used by President Obama's opponents. The chairman of the Republican Party said, quote, "We need to prosecute the president on what he promised and what he delivered." Charlie Rose asked him, "Did you say prosecute?" And the chairman persisted, "We need to prosecute this president." Very ugly language. At a rally of so-called Tea Party patriots at the Republican convention in Tampa, some speakers were openly accusing President Obama of working for the enemy. And in the view of a reporter from the New Yorker, what drove the Republican convention was hatred. Hatred of President Obama and hatred of what people there believed that he had done to this country. If the health care law becomes fully effective in 2014, I'm afraid that some militant somewhere is going to hole up in a cabin in northern Michigan, that's where they seem to be found, with a stockpile of guns, and dare the federal government to come after him because he refuses to purchase health insurance or pay a fine. Come and get me, feds. Does that sound far-fetched? Here's what Vice Presidential nominee Ryan had to say about Obamacare when he spoke to the Republican convention. Quote, "Obamacare comes to more than 2,000 pages of rules, mandates, taxes, fees, and fines that have no place in a free country." Now, isn't one this is me talking now, isn't one justified in resisting something that has no place in a free country? We have seen what extreme hatred of government can lead to. Oklahoma City, 1995, 168 people killed, nearly 700 injured. One of my students once asked me, is this the most divided we've ever been as a country? I reminded the student that we did once have a civil war. 750,000 people were killed in the Civil War. But I acknowledge that this is probably the most divided we have been since that dreadful time. And the polls back that up. The Gallup poll has a simple index to measure partisan division, the difference between the job ratings presidents get from members of their own party and from members of the opposition party. For the 6 presidents before Ronald Reagan, Eisenhower through Carter, the difference between the two parties averaged 34 points. From Reagan through George W. Bush, the difference between Republicans and Democrats jumped to 55 points. And now, in the latest polls in the last month, Barack Obama averages 84% support from Democrats and 9% from Republicans. That is an enormous 75-point gap. We have just never seen anything like that in modern times. Now, partisan hatred is nothing new. We had plenty of Clinton haters in the 90s and Bush haters from the left in the 2000s. Clinton haters resented Clinton, as I said, because of his values. But I fear that Obama haters go one step further. They think Obama is not a real American. That, of course, is what the birther movement is all about. And I noted just the other day in the newspaper that Mitt Romney appeared at a forum sponsored by the Clinton Global Initiative, and he stressed that there are big philosophical differences between him and Obama, and he called them, he said the president's approach to policy is, quote, foreign to anything this country has ever known. Now that became, of course, a catchphrase at the Republican convention. Remember, they kept talking about how we built it. It was a rebuke to President Obama's remark, you didn't build that if you were an entrepreneur. And a way of making the point that the president doesn't understand either America or free enterprise. Mitt Romney said that President Obama has tried to substitute government for a free people. Mike Huckabee called attention to the vast difference between the liberty-limiting, radical left-wing, anti-business, reckless spending, tax-hiking party of Barack Obama and Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi versus an energized America that knows we can do better. Notice, he didn't say Democrats versus Republicans. He said Democrats versus America. There were T-shirts that some Republican delegates wore that said, I am pro-American, anti-Obama, which defines Obama as anti-American. Language like that is dangerous. It could be an incitement to resistance, perhaps, God forbid, violence. It was once said that parties of the left and right in France after the revolution didn't just dream of defeating each other, they dreamed of annihilating each other. That kind of extreme partisanship has been alien to the United States, I fear, until now. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.